Well, thank you, Erin, for that introduction and for the invitation to address you today. And as Erin said, it's particularly fitting that we're here at Moore College, as the library is the repository of the Robin Gwynn collection. Robin Gwynn is a patron of the Huguenot Society of Australia and graciously donated his collection to the Society. And it contains more than 400 books, of which 27 are works printed before 1840, relating to Huguenot history, refugees, and religious persecution. And so this evening, I hope to give you an overview of who the Huguenots were, the main figures and events of the Protestant Reformation in France, the treatment of the Huguenots, and their search for refuge outside the Kingdom of France, and the Huguenot diaspora, including Australians of Huguenot descent. And as you would have gathered from the introduction, I'm presenting the talk tonight not as any sort of expert on history or theology, but as a committee member of the Society and as a person with Huguenot descent myself, Huguenot ancestry, I should say. I studied French here at Sydney University, which has stood me in good stead when following the trail of my ancestors in France and when reading the original entries in the French registers of births, deaths, and marriages. So let me begin. France has always been a predominantly Catholic country. Nevertheless, since the 16th century, it has had a lively Protestant minority who numbered, at its peak, about 10% of the population. Protestants now make up only 1% to 2% of the French population. The name Huguenot, referring to the Protestants of France, and I'll probably use those two terms interchangeably, it's a name of uncertain origin. There are various theories concerning the source of the name, including that it may have come from a Swiss political figure, Besançon Hugues, or that it came from a word in Dutch. Perhaps the name was initially an insult, but it was in common usage to refer to people of the Reformed Church of France from the time of the Protestant Reformation, that is, from the early 16th century. Every year, on the first Sunday in September, Protestants from France and around the world gather at Mialet in the Cévennes region in the south of France to commemorate their survival through the period of the désert, meaning the wilderness, which lasted from 1685 to 1788, when their religion was totally forbidden and they suffered severe persecution. Almost all the Protestant places of worship, called temples, were demolished by royal decree during this period, and many Protestants resorted to secret services in open-air settings such as forests, or in caves, or in mountains. This painting by Jeanne Lombard shows how a worship service might have looked during this period, where an itinerant Protestant pastor, at great risk to himself and to those attending, preaches in secret in the forest at night time using a sort of demountable pulpit. You may be able to see a woman holding a lantern behind her back. The Huguenot faithful had special lanterns which gave out only pinpricks of light, just enough to see their way in the dark, and with covers to quickly extinguish the light if troops were heard riding nearby. In this painting, we see preaching taking place from a cave. To show that they were genuine worshippers and not spies, Huguenots carried tokens like coins called méros. The French word méros comes from the Latin merere, meaning to deserve. So those holding the tokens were those who deserved to be in attendance. And there's one framed here on the table at the front, if you'd like to have a look at it later. They looked somewhat like this. There's some different examples of méros. The commemoration service at Mialet, under the trees, is these days attended by 15,000 or 20,000 people every year. They meet to worship together, to sing psalms and hymns, to listen to preaching, and to receive Holy Communion. Most of all, they meet to remember the strength of faith of their Huguenot ancestors who risked imprisonment or even death to meet in this way. My sister, who is here tonight, was at the 2025 meeting a few short weeks ago. And this is a scene from the meeting. You can see the preacher there in his pulpit, the same as we saw in the painting, and the row of pastors. But you can imagine with 20,000 people, it extends a long way back into the trees with the crowds. They have a band and they have a choir, and it must be very moving to be there. The founder president of the Huguenot Society of Australia, the late Reverend Dr. David Duchesne, was given the honour in 2012 of participating as a pastor at this ceremony, and we have a photo of him dressed in his pastor's robes and holding the traditional pewter communion cup. It's hard for me to imagine the logistics of administering Holy Communion to 20,000 people, but apparently it works somehow. And so to the Protestant Reformation. We commonly refer to its commencing in Germany in 1517, when the Augustinian monk Martin Luther published his 95 Theses. He had come to reject several teachings and practices of the contemporary Roman Catholic Church, in particular the view on indulgences and papal authority. But there were a number of other religious figures whose ideas were precursors to Luther. In England, there was John Wycliffe and the Lollards, who criticised the Catholic Church's wealth and authority, advocated for personal piety, and promoted access to the Bible in the vernacular, the language of the people. In Bohemia, there was Jan Hus and the Hussites. But in France, I'd like to mention two forerunners of the Reformation. The first was Pierre Valdo, Vaudès or Valdès, or in English, Peter Waldo, who lived from 1140 to 1206. He was a rich merchant in Lyon in France who became convinced of the need to tell people of a creator God who loved and cared about them. He commissioned priests to translate the scriptures into the local dialect called Lyonnais, and then he gave away the remainder of his wealth. He sent out his followers, known as the poor men of Lyon, in pairs to do simple preaching. Valdo travelled to Rome to seek permission of the Pope for his work, and permission was in fact granted by the Pope, provided the local French bishop would agree. However, the Bishop of Lyon believed that lay people should under no circumstances be given permission to preach. And so Valdo's followers were hunted down as heretics from then on and for the centuries that followed. They took refuge from persecution in the Luberon region of northern Provence and in northwestern Italy. Interestingly, as pointed out by Judith Staveley in an article in Huguenot Times, our society's journal, Francis of Assisi had similar views about poverty and the appropriateness of simple preaching, and yet he was canonized, whereas the Valdensians, or Vaudois, suffered severe persecution for centuries, including for assisting Huguenot refugees from France in the 16th century. Despite their treatment, the movement continues today, and in Italy, they are merged with the Methodist Church. I attended a Valdensian church service in Italy on Palm Sunday this year. My husband kindly came with me in case the people were a bit odd. But as it turned out, they were very friendly and welcoming. I include this photo not because it's a picture of me, but if you can see over my shoulder, you might just glimpse a poster which celebrates the 850th anniversary of the Valdensian movement, a testament to their tenacity in the face of severe persecution through the centuries. You might also notice the Huguenot cross on the wall. Another Frenchman important in connection with the Reformation, with Reformation thought before Luther, is Jacques Lefebvre, from Étaples in Picardy. Through his studies at the Sorbonne, he became interested in the Renaissance, which had taken place in Italy and Germany. He visited Italy, where he read the philosophers, including Aristotle. Lefebvre's influence spread widely, and he became admired by Erasmus, the humanist scholar. At the Sorbonne, he gathered a small band of students with similar interests. At that time, they were fervent Catholics. However, their study of scripture began to change their theological concepts. Lefebvre was, for those times, an elderly man, approaching 60 in 1508, when he published a Latin commentary on the Book of Psalms. He followed it 3 years later with his commentaries on the epistles of St. Paul. In these commentaries, he clearly enunciated the doctrine of justification by faith, that we can only be saved by grace through faith, apart from works, which became a core belief of the Protestant Reformation. His works were much admired and studied by Luther. Note that this was 5 years prior to Luther publishing his 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg in 1517. After Luther's theses, the Reform movement spread quickly in France, especially in places that had suffered economic depression and amongst those who had grievances against the established order of government. The most important figure of the French Reformation proper was, of course, John Calvin, or Jean Calvin, who lived from 1509 to 1564. He was born in Noyon, 60 miles northeast of Paris. He was educated at the University of Paris and had studied for a law degree at the University of Orléans. Protestant ideas were growing at this time, but so was official repression. And I just digress for a moment to talk about the repression which became more determined after the affair of the placards, l'affaire des placards, in 1534. I don't think they'd heard of brand management or public relations at that time, because some reformers thought it would be a good idea to have posters printed railing against the so-called evils of the Catholic Mass. The title was True Articles on the Horrific, Extensive and Unbearable Abuses of the Papal Mass, made up in direct opposition to the sanctity of Jesus Christ. Not really calculated to allow for the peaceful coexistence of Protestants and Catholics. The posters were put up widely on the night of 17th of October, 1534, and one was even pinned to the door of the king's bedroom in Amboise. The other thing I noticed I took this photo from the display at the National Archives in Paris, and that's an actual printed placard, but I noticed that it was a bit like a sermon where they say, I've got 4 points. Firstly, secondly, because I can see each one of these paragraphs begins firstly, secondly, thirdly. So, this poster affair highlights the role played by printing in spreading theories deemed by authorities to be heretical. As Mark Greengrass writes in his book on the French Reformation, the power of the new printing presses to propagate dissent was unparalleled, and there were no coherent mechanisms readily to hand for controlling it. I was interested to read that in 1537, royal authorities ordered printers to give to the keeper of the King's Library a copy of all books printed to ensure the orthodoxy of their content. This was the start of the practice of legal deposit in France. After this placard affair, Calvin's life was threatened, and he sought safety in Basel in Switzerland. In fact, Calvin spent most of his adult life in exile in Strasbourg and Geneva, although he did come and go from France. He wrote his Institutes of the Christian Religion in Basel in 1536. He gave to the churches of France their Calvinist theology and their efficient system of church government. So why did the reform ideas spread quickly in France? Well, the ground was made fertile for the spread of Reformation ideas by various factors. The growth of the middle classes in cities and towns, the discovery of printing, as I've said, brought to the world by Gutenberg around 1455, which permitted the rapid copying of texts. 100, 500 or 1,000 examples could be made without the errors of successive copyists. The development of schools in the towns meant that reading was no longer the exclusive preserve of the clergy. Having said that, only about 10% of the population of France was literate at the beginning of the 16th century. Also, the growth of local languages rather than just Latin, French being made the official language of France in 1539, and then a general dissatisfaction with aspects of church life. Humanists objected to the absolute control of the church, while religious reformers objected to the medieval interpretations of the Holy Scripture. Reformers set about a re-examination of the original documents of the faith, as found in the Gospels of Christ the teachings of his apostles, and the beliefs of the early church fathers. As mentioned already, the spread of the new religion in France was helped by printing, greater literacy, and translations of the Bible. It could not have been easy translating the scriptures into French. For one thing, the Parlement and the Sorbonne decreed that all translations of scripture should be suppressed. For another, it must have been a huge challenge to decide on the choice of words, given that the Latin version had been long settled and relied on as authentic by the Catholic Church. One commentator wrote, concerning Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples' translation of the Latin Bible into French, which appeared in 1530, "It is hard for us to imagine what a radical step it must have been for a scholar like Lefebvre to depart from the Latin of Christendom, in which meanings were well defined, into the fluid and unformed medium of the vernacular." 5 years after Lefebvre's Bible, in 1535, a cousin of Calvin, called Pierre Robert Olivetan, published his Bible in French, based for the first time on translations of the Hebrew and Greek texts rather than the Latin. Around this same time, in 1539, Henry VIII in England, despite his earlier opposition, gave direction to print the Bible in English, and that a copy of it be set up in each parish church. Some of you may have seen an example of the Great Bible of 1539, which is in a glass case in St Andrew's Cathedral here in Sydney. It was a present in 1953 from the parish of St Andrew's Barnwell in Northamptonshire in gratitude for Australian generosity in the post-war restoration of Britain. But back to France. The first Huguenot community in French territory was organised at Meaux, which is M-E-A-U-X, in Picardy, not far from Paris, in 1546. It was modelled on the Protestant community at Strasbourg. Meaux is now a pretty peaceful town on the river, but if you look hard, as I did when visiting, you'll find a small plaque on a wall above a supermarket, which marks the site of the house of Étienne Mangin. Mangin and a pastor had visited Calvin in Strasbourg and then returned to Meaux, where they organised the first Protestant services in France, held in Mangin's house. It was during one of these services that the authorities descended and arrested 60 of the faithful who had just taken Holy Communion. They were sent to Paris to be tried. Now, apologies if this makes you feel queasy, but the outcome of the trial 2 years later was that 14 were sentenced to be tortured and burned alive. 5 were to be flogged and banished, and 10, all women, were to be set free. The remaining 30-odd were sentenced to various forms of penance, probably including public humiliation. Mangin and the pastor, after severe torture, had their tongues cruelly cut out and were then burnt at the stake. The tiny wall plaque which you see here commemorates the fact of the 14 being martyred in the Place du Marché. Descendants of Étienne Mangin now live in New Zealand. Under the shadow of such repression, Protestant communities gradually coalesced in the 1550s. In 1554, we see Calvin writing to say how to gather a church, slowly by reading of the gospel, singing of psalms, and meeting together for mutual support. The Reform movement spread in many French cities and towns, among the nobility, and especially among artisans, doctors, lawyers, merchants, and the middle classes, and in some areas among the peasants too. In the small town in Poitou, where some of my Huguenot ancestors originated, the local lord of the manor became Protestant after hearing the ideas of Calvin. The townspeople followed suit, and over time, the Catholic congregation dwindled to the point where the Catholic Church was abandoned and fell into ruins. This must have been what the authorities feared should Protestantism be allowed to grow and dominate in towns and cities. The Protestants in that town met for worship in the chapel of the castle. It was only when Cardinal Richelieu, implacable opponent of the Huguenots, who became Prime Minister in 1624, came to the town that the chapel was taken over and the Catholic Mass restored. The Huguenots then built their own temple, and again, not keeping a low profile, built it so close to the chapel that the Catholic congregation were bothered by hearing the Huguenots singing their psalms in French. The Protestant temple was then destroyed by order of the king and not rebuilt until after the French Revolution. I've mentioned psalm singing. The psalms were hugely important to the Huguenots, and Calvin was involved in collecting together settings for the 150 psalms which had been translated into French verse and set to music. This became the Genevan or Huguenot Psalter. I found this quote from Martin Henry Baird about the psalms very moving. He wrote, "The psalms were the badge by which the Huguenots were recognised by friend and foe alike. They were the stimulus of the brave, the battle cry of the combatant, and the last consolatory words whispered in the ears of the dying." This map, where the dots represent Huguenot churches in the 16th century in France, shows that the Reform movement was particularly successful in the south and west, away from Paris and the king's control. By the 1560s, Protestants formed a sizable minority in some towns and an overwhelming majority in a few towns, such as La Rochelle, Montpellier, and Nîmes. The demand for ministers to be sent out from Geneva was huge. In 1555, the first Paris church was established, and in 1559, the first synod was held in Paris, which endorsed two documents, a confession of faith and a discipline. I think there were 74 deputies that came to that, representing 15 churches. And yet only 2 years later, the Huguenot leader, Admiral Coligny, presented evidence of 2,150 well-organised churches to Catherine de' Medici. Mind you, I have read that he gave instructions that the more churches that can be included, the better, probably to frighten and impress the Queen Regent. At this time, there was growing conflict between the Huguenots and the Catholic Church and royalty. A failed plot by a Protestant faction called the Amboise Conspiracy to gain control over the French king, and then a massacre at Vassy, where Huguenot worshippers were murdered by troops of the Duc de Guise, escalated tensions further. With both sides taking up arms, a terrible 30-year period commenced, in which 8 wars of religion took place between 1562 and 1594. The first 3 wars occurred in rapid succession, and then, possibly in an attempt to end the conflict with one blow, the assassination of most of the Huguenot leaders was arranged. It took place in Paris on the night of 24th of August, 1572, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. In the background of this painting of the event, we see the Louvre, and standing in front of it, Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Regent in black, who many historians regard as the main instigator of the massacre. To the right and in front of the Louvre is the townhouse of Anne de Laval, where Admiral de Coligny, leader of the Protestants, was stabbed and killed. We see in this painting his body being thrown from the window, after which he was decapitated and hung upside down from a gibbet. The slaughter continued all that day in Paris and in the following days and weeks in outlying regions. An estimated 3,000 Protestants were killed in Paris, and some estimate that as many as 70,000 Protestants may have been killed in successive massacres across the country. Many Huguenots fled to fortified cities and fought back. 5 more wars of religion followed, in which terrible massacres were perpetrated by both sides. From the Huguenot side, in areas where they dominated, Catholic worship was banned, and Huguenots engaged in destruction of statuary and icons in formerly Catholic cathedrals. The wars of religion eventually came to an end when the Protestant Henry of Navarre became King of France in 1593. He was known as Good King Henry, Le Bon Roi Henri, and I think he does look benevolent in this portrait. Do you agree? In order to bring about peace, however, he had to abjure his Protestant religion and become a Catholic. Even so, he didn't forget his Huguenot supporters and signed the Edict of Nantes in 1598. These are photos I took of the National Archives buildings in Paris and the edict, which is on display there. It's normally hailed as giving the Huguenots considerable political and religious rights, although it didn't give them total religious freedom everywhere in France. They were given places de sûreté, armed strongholds, to prevent more massacres. A society member, Roger Duchot, writing in Huguenot Times, said that in its general articles, the edict provided for the granting of a number of rights to Protestants, including freedom of conscience, freedom of worship, and freedom to build their own churches in those towns and cities that were controlled by them as of August 1597. The articles also bestowed a number of civil rights, including admission to school and the holding of public offices and parliamentary posts. Henry IV also issued 2 royal brevets, which provided for the payment of salaries to Huguenot pastors and, importantly, allowed Huguenots to establish garrisons of troops and militia in the 200-odd towns under their control. In the fortified Huguenot towns, Henry subsidised the cost of maintaining those garrisons. The edict took time to be ratified by the city parlement. For example, Paris ratified in 1599, Dijon in 1600, Rouen in 1609. Parlement grudgingly accepted the edict and heeded Henry's appeasement advice in order to achieve peace. As historian Robert Knecht says, the Edict of Nantes provided for the coexistence of the Catholic and Protestant faiths until such time as Catholic unity could be restored. Although the edict was more generous to the Huguenots than earlier settlements, they remained dissatisfied as they were not given equality with Catholics. The Catholics were not pleased because it granted too much to the Huguenots, and Henry was assassinated in 1610. The next king, Louis XIII, and his minister Cardinal Richelieu, fought in 1621 to 1628 to defeat the Huguenots' military power. The terrible siege of 1628 defeated La Rochelle, which was the last Protestant military stronghold. Although defeated, the Huguenots were allowed to continue to worship according to the edict. However, they were dependent solely on the goodwill of the monarch for this. This goodwill ran out with the next king, Louis XIV, who hated the Huguenots. From 1661, he began a long campaign to encourage or force them to become Catholic. General harassment and forcible conversion of thousands of Protestants followed. Edicts and declarations were passed trying to make life impossible for the Protestants of France. Their synods were forbidden, their temples closed and demolished, their schools, colleges, and even bookshops were closed, and they were forbidden to be doctors, lawyers, public servants, and even midwives. The cruelest edict was that which said that Protestant children could be taken away from their parents after the age of 7 and forcibly re-educated as Catholics. In 1681, in Poitou, began the dragonnade. This was the forcible billeting of dragoon soldiers on Huguenot families. It looks quite civilized in this painting by Jules Girardet, but in reality the troops were encouraged to behave outrageously, smashing everything, consuming all food supplies, mistreating the Protestant men and raping the women. If a family agreed to convert, then troops would be moved to another house. This forced many Protestants to make an insincere conversion. Some of my own ancestors were married as new converts to Catholicism, but by the time of their deaths, they are recorded as Huguenots who died in heresy outside the communion of the Church. The diary of Jean Migaud, who lived from 1645 to 1706, a schoolteacher from Poitou, contains harrowing descriptions such as that of the dragoons in his house holding his pregnant wife against a fire until she fainted. He fled to the Netherlands as a widower with 10 children and wrote his journal so that his children would be aware of their own history. A copy printed in 1825 of Jean Migaud's diary is on display here in the library. As mentioned, many temples were demolished on the king's orders. This is the temple at Lyon called Le Paradis. The painting might be too small to see, but there are dogs and children inside. They were allowed as long as they were well behaved. The decor was simple, no statuary or religious paintings, and the pulpit was central, as preaching was the most important part of worship. The temple at Charenton, where the Paris Protestants worshipped, was burnt down in 1621 following anti-heretical fury, then rebuilt 2 years later as a huge edifice accommodating 4,000 worshippers. It was demolished in 1685 when Louis XIV, by the Edict of Fontainebleau, revoked the Edict of Nantes. Protestants in France then had only 3 choices. They could convert to Catholicism, worship in secret, or flee the country. The word refugee comes from the French word réfugié, which was used to refer to the almost 200,000 Protestants who fled France for any nearby non-Catholic country. In 1715, Louis XIV declared that the Protestant religion no longer existed in France. And yet in the same year, an assembly of determined Protestants occurred at Nîmes, devoted to restoring the Protestant church. Despite this, anyone found doing anything of a Protestant nature would be severely punished. All the pastors were ordered into exile and given 2 weeks' notice to go. Any women found going to secret prayer meetings were imprisoned, some in the Tour de Constance, the Tower of Constance, at Aigues-Mortes on the Mediterranean coast. One prisoner here was Marie Durand, who was imprisoned at the age of 19 for attending a Huguenot service. She spent the next 38 years in the tower. She could have been released at any time if she'd agreed to convert, but she remained true to her faith. She famously scratched "Résister" into the stones of the cell, resist. She was set free in 1768 and returned to her village, where she died 8 years later. Men, on the other hand, could be sent to be galley slaves. I don't know if you know about this horrific form of punishment. These men were chained 6 to a bench and slept and ate there when not rowing. The area was often open to the weather. They received 2 shirts and a pair of pants each year. They had no opportunity to wash, and lice and disease were rife. They received frequent beatings. The life expectancy of the average galley slave was only 2 or 3 years, though a very few managed to survive for decades. Our secretary, Robert Nash, will be giving a talk about the galley slaves during our lecture series next year. All are welcome to attend, and more details will be available from our website or Facebook group page next year. Burials of Huguenots were not permitted in cemeteries, and so were often the corpses were secretly buried in forests or on farms. A further form of punishment of Huguenots was that their corpses could be exhumed and dragged around the town on a hurdle. From 1745 to 1754, persecution of the Huguenots again intensified, but public opinion started to turn against the persecutions. As an example of the treatment Huguenots received, in Grenoble in 1745 and 1746, more than 300 Protestants were condemned because of their religion. Of these, 29 nobles were condemned to be deprived of their nobility and their possessions, 14 persons were banished, 4 were condemned to be flogged by the common hangman, 6 women were sentenced to have their heads shaved and be imprisoned, some of them for life. 2 men were condemned to be placed in the pillory, 34 were sent to the galleys for 3 to 5 years, 6 were sent to the galleys for 10 years, and 116, among whom were 46 gentlemen and 2 knights of the Order of Saint Louis, were sent to the galleys for life, and 4 were sentenced to death. The only crime of which these persons had been guilty was that they'd been detected attending Protestant worship, contrary to law. The Huguenots were generally highly skilled in all sorts of occupations. The king had forbidden the... No, sorry, I need to go back. My apologies. As I was saying, the king had forbidden the Huguenots to leave France because he didn't want to lose such useful and hard-working subjects. But nonetheless, they left in their thousands, often by secret routes. They went anywhere where they could practice their religion peacefully and earn a living. Principal countries of refuge were the Netherlands, England, Germany, Switzerland, Ireland, Scandinavia, America, and even Russia and South Africa. About 200,000 people left France at this time. In some places, they joined French-speaking congregations that already existed. The French Church of London in Threadneedle Street had been founded in 1550 under a charter from Edward VI, the Protestant son of Henry VIII. This scene is from a painting of French refugees arriving in England. The French Church of London in Threadneedle Street welcomed the new arrivals of the 1680s and organised charity to help them. By 1700, there were about 25,000 to 30,000 Huguenots in London. In the West End, Soho, they practiced many skilled crafts, for example, silver and goldsmithing, tailoring, dressmaking, engraving, sculpture, bookbinding, clockmaking, jewellery, fan making, furniture, ironwork, gunsmithing, glassblowing, ceramics, and many other trades. They also settled in the East End, in the suburb of Spitalfields, where they were silk weavers. This is the Église Neuve on the corner of Brick Lane, which is still standing and is now a mosque. The Huguenot community looked after its own poor and destitute, and this is La Providence, the French hospital or old people's home, which was founded in 1718. It's still a working charity today. The major country of refuge was the Netherlands, which welcomed between 50 and 60,000 refugees. There was already a network of Walloon churches founded by French-speaking Protestant refugees in the 16th century. The French Protestant community in the Netherlands was well established and much respected. However, the Dutch couldn't cope with the number of refugees they were receiving, so encouraged some to go to their colonies, including the Cape of Good Hope in 1688. Here, the French formed 20% of the first European settlers and built themselves beautiful farms. Nowadays, many South African families have Huguenot origins, with names such as Duplessis, de Villiers, de Klerk, Joubert, Pinard, etc. If you follow rugby union and the Springboks, you'd be familiar with many of those names. Many refugees passed through Switzerland, where the Protestant cantons did what they could to help them. Geneva had been a centre of French-speaking Protestantism since the 16th century. About 20,000 settled in Switzerland, establishing or strengthening industries like watchmaking, chocolate making, and silk weaving. Here's one Huguenot descendant you'll probably recognise. His mother's name is Durand. About 30,000 refugees found a haven in parts of Germany, particularly in Prussia and Hessen. The Elector of Brandenburg, Prussia, issued an edict only 2 weeks after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, encouraging French Protestants to come to his country. In the early 18th century, a third of the population of Berlin were Huguenots. This is the French church in the centre of Berlin. This imposing building shows what a large influence they had on German life, culture, and economy. Surprisingly, perhaps, Ireland was also an important place of refuge for Huguenots, particularly soldiers. William of Orange came over from Holland in 1688 to rule Britain and supplant his Catholic father-in-law, James I. William brought many Huguenot soldiers over with him, and when he and James fought it out in Ireland, a large part of William's army was made up of Huguenots. They won the Battle of Boyne in 1690, which guaranteed Protestant domination of Ireland for over 200 years. The Huguenots settled in many parts of Ireland, particularly urban centres like Dublin, Cork, Waterford, etc. They enlivened its life and economy, helping the linen industry and founding the Bank of Ireland. About 10,000 Huguenot refugees settled in the American colonies, principally at Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and South Carolina. Their contribution was mainly mercantile and artistic. Paul Revere was a Boston silversmith and the son of a refugee. He fought against the British in the American Revolution, but other American Huguenots were loyalists who sided with the British. So what about Australia? There's never been any direct emigration of Huguenots to our country, but since 1788, their descendants have come here from many lands. A few convicts, for example, the silk weaver Jacob Bellet, who was on the First Fleet. A family reunion of Bellet descendants is due to take place next week in Hobart. Colonel James Morissette was among the soldiers who guarded the convicts, and he was the son of a Huguenot swordsmith from Soho. This is a Londoner, James Duchot, who eventually prospered in the Hunter Valley. Huguenot descendants have appeared at every level of society. This is Charles La Trobe, the first governor of the colony of Victoria. He did much to encourage the development of Victoria and the city of Melbourne, which now has a university and a library named after him. In the artistic field, Harold Casno is highly respected as the father of Australian photography. And William Pigony, the son of a convict from Hobart, is seen as our first Australian-born landscape artist of merit. He painted landscapes extensively in Tasmania and in New South Wales. Sir Harry Chauvel carried on the Huguenot military tradition. He was the first Australian to achieve the rank of general and led the campaign in the First World War to drive the Turks from Palestine. The Perdriau family exemplify the Huguenot business tradition. They pioneered steam ferries on Sydney Harbour and founded a rubber company. This is Ralph Perdriau, who later became a High Court judge and pioneered the system of workers' compensation for injuries at work. Huguenot descendants turn up in very Australian situations. This is Roy Cazaly, one of our greatest AFL players and coaches, who played in Tasmania and Melbourne. He was descended from a Spitalfields silk weaving family. And we mustn't forget Marnus Labuschagne on the cricket pitch, who's from a South African Huguenot family. Augustine Souberon was one of the very few French Protestants who've settled directly in Australia. She was a founder of Kambala Girls' School in Sydney and also campaigned to raise money to help refugees in the First World War. And the Alliance Française recently renamed a room after her, and they called it Place Augustine Souberon. Minard Cromelin was part of a tradition of strong Huguenot women. She was a keen conservationist and fought hard to preserve native wildlife and flora. She set up a nature reserve north of Sydney and allowed Sydney University to establish the first biological field study centre in Australia there. Continuing with strong women, Frida Dufour was a mountaineer and the first woman to climb Aoraki Mount Cook in New Zealand. Her father, Frederick Eccleston Dufour, was instrumental in the establishment of Ku-ring-gai National Park and the Art Gallery of New South Wales. He chose the brass names of artists and thinkers that are displayed around the outside of the gallery. We end our slideshow with a portrait of Paul Crespin, a London goldsmith, circa 1726. The portrait gives a sense of the self-assurance of a craftsman who knows he has made a place for himself through hard work and dedication to his art. Descendants of this man live in Australia and New Zealand. To conclude, and with your indulgence, just a brief word about our society. We're a historical society rather than a religious one, though we do hold one annual church service to celebrate the faith of our forefathers. The aims of the society are to foster a bond of friendship amongst people interested in the Huguenots, to promote awareness of the Huguenots and their contribution to all countries where they and their descendants have settled, including Australia, and to offer advice on Huguenot family history research. We're also very pleased that our members in the last few years have donated sufficient funds each year for us to endow a scholarship through Settlement Services International for a refugee in Australia to undertake vocational education. We have a wealth of resources on our website to assist our members, and if you'd like to know more, I have some brochures here. And if you'd like to read more stories of Australian Huguenot families, we have 2 publications available also from our website. And if you're on Facebook, please do join our group called, interestingly, Huguenot Society of Australia. So thanks so much again to Moore College for this opportunity, and to you all for coming this evening.
Thank you very much, Pamela. What a wonderful presentation. We have a few questions that have come through. Firstly, how Protestant were the Humanists? That's a tough one.
I don't actually think I've got an answer for that one. Obviously, the Humanists had objections to some aspects of the control and authority of the established church in France. So many of them would have had sympathies for Calvin and his ideas. But other than that, I'm not really sure.
What was the immediate motive of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre?
There's disagreement about what the motives might have been. What I said in my talk was that it may have been a plan to stop the wars of religion by getting rid of, cutting off the heads of the Huguenot movement by killing in one blow all their major leaders. So that's one thought. Another thought is that this was political. I did read on a website called Catholic Answers a very long description today of their thinking on the reasons for the St. Bartholomew's massacre. But as far as I know, that was really the main reason, that they were trying to get rid of all the leaders of the Huguenots in one go.
So you mentioned one of the possible punishments for Huguenots in France was having their children removed from them at the age of 7 and placed in Catholic families. And there's a question about, did this actually happen, or was it just a threat?
I understand that it actually happened, that children were sent to convents and brought up as Catholics, taken away from their families. If they were not baptised in the Catholic Church, they were regarded as illegitimate children, and I suppose in that sense they could easily be removed from their families and brought up as good Catholics because they hadn't been baptised in the church. Some were, of course, baptised secretly by pastors in the désert period, but those baptisms, same as the marriages, were not recognised by the Catholic Church.
Were there any aspects of theology or culture that made the Huguenots distinct from the broader Reformed Church?
Well, I've been using the word Huguenot to be synonymous with the Reformed Church of France. The Catholics called it the so-called Reformed Church of France. But I'm not sure if this questioner was asking, was there something different about the Huguenot theology from the Reform movement, say, in Germany? Do you think that's what they're asking? And I don't know the answer to that one. What are the differences between Calvinist theology and Lutheran theology? And there'll be other people here that would be much better placed to answer that one than me.
Would you know what was Louis XIII's war against the Huguenots called?
I can't recall anything.
Okay. Did any of the Huguenots who settled in England or London over time contribute to Protestantism? For example, writing of hymns.
I think they must have. The Huguenots in the West End, at Soho, were much more likely to become conformist. So although they had the prayer book translated into French, they followed the forms of the Anglican Church. Whereas the Huguenots in the East End, the silk weavers in Spitalfields, because they weren't in occupations requiring them to talk to their customers and so on, tended to remain as French speakers, and the French churches in the East End were non-conformist, so they maintained their French Calvinist forms of religion. But over time, and it wasn't very many generations before, the Huguenots were sort of absorbed into English society generally, and so I suppose they were as liable as anybody else to write a hymn.
In your opinion, to what extent did the flight of skilled middle-class artisans contribute to the French Revolution a century later?
They certainly say that the loss of such a large number of skilled people meant that France was behind the rest in the Industrial Revolution. The link, though, with the French Revolution, I haven't thought through. No, I don't know if anybody else has got something to say on that one. I'm looking at some fellow committee members in case they can help me out.
Technology away from France into England, English ships.
I suppose if French society was a little running behind the rest of Europe, people may have felt more aggrieved about their situation. They had less clever people there to try to improve their situation in society, and the gap between the rich and the poor may have been widened from that point of view, I suppose, and the grievances leading to them overthrowing the nobility and having the revolution may have been exacerbated by the loss of that middle class of well-educated and highly skilled artisans. Just guessing.
Just those reflections on the slave boats, those things were absolutely fetid. They stank to high heavens, absolutely. They were known for miles away for high seas.
Were Huguenots also involved in Freemasonry?
I'm getting a nod, so I think the answer is yes. It was predominantly a Protestant movement, was it not? So I guess Huguenots are also involved, but I don't have any specific information. I'm sorry on that.
And lastly, are the psalm songs still sung today?
Yes, they are. And when I attended a Sunday service called in French a culte in the Oratoire du Louvre, which is the big church in Paris next to the Louvre Museum, which was given to the Huguenots by Napoleon after the French Revolution, we used this book, which is the French Psalter, and its subtitle is The 150 Psalms of the Reform Movement. So yes, they're all in here. Some of them have had the words slightly modernised, but they definitely sing a lot of psalms. And Penny will attest to that from going to the Assemblée at Mialet just a few weeks ago, that they definitely sang many psalms, and you said they sounded as if they were from the time of the Reformation. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you again, everyone, for coming. And please thank Pamela once more for her excellent presentation.